across three questions, three particular questions. First, the anthropological nature of philosophy. Second, the dialectical nature of philosophy. And third, the paradoxical relationship between philosophy and Tao. So, we are coming this morning to the question of the dialectical nature of philosophy. We have said that the dialectical nature of philosophy is opposed to the idea of an analytical nature of philosophy. More generally, maybe this opposition is also the opposition between two conceptions. The first one is philosophy finally is a knowledge. A knowledge as some others, from mathematics to human sciences. And the second conception is philosophy is in relationship with knowledge, naturally. Philosophy is not outside the question of knowledge. In fact, the question of knowledge is a very important question inside philosophy itself. In classical philosophy, it's possible to say that the question of knowledge is the first important question inside philosophy. Is really we know something, or finally we know nothing, and so on? All that is great discussion inside philosophy. So we cannot say that philosophy is without relationship with knowledge. It's completely absurd. But the question is, certainly there is inside philosophy a question of knowledge, but is philosophy exactly a knowledge by itself? And we have seen that when the question of something exists, generally speaking, the question of something is not inside the something itself. For example, the question of what is mathematics is not a mathematical question. It's a philosophical question. And we have said that if the question, what is philosophy, is inside philosophy, it's a sort of exception. It's because the question of what is this thing, this other thing, and so on, the question of what is practically a philosophical question. It's the question of the very essence of something. What is really this something, what is the essence of something? The essence of mathematics, but also the essence of nature, the essence of God, and so on. So, if the question, what is a philosophical question which we can apply to philosophy itself. If the question, what is philosophy, is inside philosophy, probably it is because philosophy is precisely not exactly a knowledge. Because a knowledge is determined by its object. The knowledge is always the knowledge of something. And as a knowledge of something, it's not reducible to the something itself, naturally. There is a distance between the knowledge of something and the existence of something. And it's a question of what is the object of science, what is the object of physics, or what is the object of the history, and so on. But you understand that it's not possible properly to say that the question, what is philosophy, is a question of the knowledge of an object. Because philosophy is not an object. And so, when we have the field where the question, what is philosophy, exists, this field is not the field of the relationship between the knowledge and the thing and something. It's different. It's absolutely different. And concerning this problem, we have a very classical tradition which says that philosophy is not a knowledge because precisely philosophy is a question. That the very essence of the existence of philosophy is the existence of some particular questions. It's a very classic affirmation. At the beginning of a class of philosophy, the professor of philosophy says that philosophy is an infinite question, in fact. Not answer, but question, and so on. We shall see that this definition is not really precise. Philosophy is a question, okay. There is many fields of human activity where some questions exist and which are not reducible to philosophy. So certainly, if philosophy is a field of questions, it's a field of particular questions and not of the questions in general. But in fact, all that says certainly that philosophy is not an object, and so the fact that what is philosophy is a question inside philosophy cannot be reduced to the question of the knowledge of philosophy. Philosophy is not the knowledge of itself, because precisely philosophy is not an object. Certainly philosophy is a question of itself, what is philosophy, but it's not a knowledge of itself. So first we can say that the dialectical nature of philosophy is also the fact that philosophy is not a positive knowledge, is not a science, is something without any object. And it's precisely the opposition to the idea of an analytical nature of philosophy, because if we have an analytical view of philosophy, we are saying, in fact, that philosophy is a knowledge with some definite object. For example, the language, the question of what is the meaning, what is a sentence with a meaning, and a sentence which is a nonsense, and so on and so on. All that constitute the possible field for a specific knowledge, and this knowledge is philosophy. So the dialectical nature is, for the moment, something like a pure negation. Philosophy is not a knowledge. And we can go from this point to the famous affirmation of Socrates: the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. The only thing that I know is that I know nothing. Which is precisely the clear affirmation that philosophy is not a knowledge. I know nothing. But there is something like dialectical ambiguity, because Socrates is also saying that he knows something. He knows something. What is that sort of thing? Precisely nothing. So in fact, the sentence of Socrates is saying that on one point, something is the same thing that nothing. What we can know nothing as the unique thing that we know. So that we have a sort of equation, a primitive equation, not only in my vision of Socrates, but all the great history of philosophy, which is an equivalence between thing and nothing, the possibility of that sort of absolutely paradoxical equivalence. In some sense, for the philosophical life, from the philosophical point of view, it's possible to examine a sort of equivalence of thing and nothing. And what is that sort of question? This question is a question of negativity. The question of negativity and the question of the negation, the function of the nothingness, and so on. And what Socrates is saying is that maybe if philosophy is not a knowledge, it's because the object of philosophy is precisely not a thing, like country, nature, physical objects, and so on. But that the great question of philosophy is precisely the question of nothingness, the question of the existence of negativity. And it is why, from the very beginning, there is a close relationship between the dialectical nature of philosophy and the question of negativity in general. All the aspects of the question of negativity, the equation between thing and nothing, the existence of nothingness, the paradoxical existence of nothingness. So there is something like the hidden affirmation in philosophy, which is present in all the history of philosophy, which is it possible to know something which does not exist? It is possible to know something which does not exist. And why philosophy is not a knowledge? Because the answer to this question is certainly not that there is a knowledge of something which does not exist. If something exists, is it a knowledge, a specific knowledge of that sort of thing? Natural object, psychological state, and so on. But if something does not exist, the relationship to this non-existence, that non-existence, cannot be a knowledge, because a knowledge is the knowledge of an object, and precisely something which does not exist is not an object. You know? And so the existence of philosophy is always also the existence of the possibility that something is which does not exist. Which does not exist as an object of the world. And so we can say that philosophy is entirely on a difference, a very obscure and complex difference, which is the difference between to be and to exist. And the question of the distance between to be and to exist is also, naturally, the question of the distance between thing and nothing, the distance between being and nothingness, and so on. All that to give you an idea of what is the dialectical nature of philosophy. The dialectical nature of philosophy is to be not reducible to the question of the knowledge of an object, but to introduce the possibility of the being of something which does not exist, which is not in the form of an object, and which, after all, can be affirmed in its presence, in its being, and so on, outside the form of the knowledge of an object. We can name positivism, which is a sort of anti-philosophical philosophy. We can name positivism the affirmation that there exists only knowledge, that the conception of the distance between to be and to exist, and the question of something which is equivalent in some sense to nothing is absurd. The positivism affirms what exists is only in the form of objectivity, and our relationship to objectivity is knowledge, and the true form of knowledge is science. Definition, clear definition of positivism. So, the positivism say all what exists is objectively existent. It's the only form of being, and the only form of positive relationship to objectivity is knowledge, and finally science. So the conclusion is either philosophy is a science, or philosophy does not exist really. Philosophy is imaginary, illusion, and so on. Pure faith, without any objective value. In fact, positivism is, in my conviction, the only consistent form of analytic point of view. If you are in the analytic point of view, you must be positivist finally. You must say that we are closed in the form of knowledge. Our rational relationship to what exists is only knowledge, and we must affirm, because it's the case in the contemporary world, that the real and efficient form of knowledge is science. And so we must say that the ideal of philosophy must be science. Philosophy must become a science. And if it is not the case, philosophy must be criticized and finally suppressed. And the true positivism affirms the necessity to restitute all form of knowledge to the field of science, and that philosophy as such, and precisely metaphysics, is something like a dream, something like a dream of the imaginary dream. Actually, the problem is that that sort of assertion is of philosophical nature. Positivism is finally itself not a science. And why it is not a science? Because there does not exist a science of sciences. So there does not exist a science which is saying that what is science. And so when the positivist says what exists really is science and we must transform philosophy in a form of science, he says that inside philosophy and not inside the science. And so we can return to the positivist is our proper question. From what point of view are you saying that that sort of process is a science and that sort of process is not a science? If all knowledge is a science, the knowledge of what is a science is also a science. Donc you affirm the existence of science of sciences. But a science of sciences does not really exist, or if something like that exists, it's philosophy. And why? Because we have to discern what is the real being of science, and not only the existence of science. We know that there exists mathematics, biology, physics, and so on. History, scientific history, maybe, okay. But when we are saying that all that is of scientific nature, you are saying something concerning all sciences, which is not inside sciences. A science don't say why it is a science. And so we say that existing science are science not from the strict point of view of their existence, but from the point of view of their being. They are sciences. And what exists is not the science, but many sciences, many different sciences. And what is in common across all sciences, and the authorization to say all that is of scientific nature, is a question not of existence, but a question of being. You understand? And so the distance between to be and to exist is in fact assumed by the positivist. And if the question of the distance between to be and to exist is precisely the dialectical nature of philosophy, it's impossible to reduce all that to analytic point of view. There is something dialectical in positivism itself. Now, all that is a proof of what, you can say. All that is a proof that positivists can assume a small part of philosophy. Strict positivism can assume, absolutely must assume, a part of philosophy. Or if you want, the analytical vision must assume a part of dialectical vision. And when there is this necessity, is precisely when the analytical point of view affirms the analytical point of view. When you are in the analytical point of view, okay? So you practice sciences, you are a physician, you are a mathematician, and so on, and you say all that exists, but you say nothing else. If you say the analytical point of view is true and the dialectical point of view is false, you are saying something which is in the dialectical point of view, by necessity, because you are naturally in a distinction between to be and to exist. And you are in the position to say what is the being of science. The being of science as it is present in all sciences. And so, in the opposition between dialectical point of view and analytical point of view is a dialectical opposition. When the analytical philosopher criticizes the dialectical philosopher, he is inside the dialectical point of view. He cannot be inside purely analytical point of view. In the purely analytical point of view, you cannot be in the form of negativity. And if you say something negative, you are in contradiction with yourself. If you say dialectical point of view is not true, the not true is naturally a distinction between what exists and what is really. Because the dialectical point of view exists. And so if you say that it's false, you are saying something concerning not its existence, but its being, naturally. Because we cannot say the dialectical point of view does not exist. It exists, in fact. So when you say, it exists, but it's false, you are saying something which is not reducible to the question of existence or non-existence. So, to be and to exist are not the same verb. It's a proof. I think it's a proof. It's a dialectical proof, but it's a proof. It's a proof that positivism exists, but assumes by necessity a small part of dialecticity. As a point of view, not as a pure existence, naturally. So, when analytical point of view criticizes dialectical point of view, it assumes something of the dialectical point of view itself. And it is why the question of negativity is always at the very beginning of philosophy itself. We have naturally two fundamental examples, the example of Socrates, Plato, and the example of Descartes. Socrates, we have said, is the question, the only thing that I know is that I know nothing, is precisely to put the question of negativity as the first sentence of philosophy. The equivalence, the possible equivalence between thing and nothing. The only thing that I know is that I know nothing. So the only thing what Socrates at the beginning of philosophy is saying is that there is a possible equivalence between thing and nothing. And this possible equivalence between thing and nothing is to say that something can be and don't exist. So we are here at a very profound and original point, you understand? Because this question of distance between to be and to exist is really maybe the philosophical question. Because there are many manners to say that. The purely abstract manner, there is a distance between to be and to exist, says nothing concerning this distance. So it's purely verbal, it's purely, in fact, the distance between what is the distance between to be and to exist is a question. When you affirm this distance, you affirm the distance as a question. And so it is why philosophy is in all its history in relationship to ontology. If we name ontology, which is a word, as many others, created by Aristotle. Aristotle, the man of classifications, the great creation of the discourse of university, invented many words of the traditional and classical and modern philosophy, and the word ontology. What is ontology? Ontology is, as you know, the science of being as such, of being as being. So is the proposition of a complete science of the verb to be. What is the signification of the verb to be? And there is always a part of ontology in any philosophy. The part of ontology which is precisely the possibility to give signification to the question of the distance between to be and to exist. That is, to be is not reducible to what we know that exists as object in the world. And so the question of the distance between to be and to exist is of ontological nature, the sense of Aristotle, and so it's really the very at the core of the dialectical vision. But at the beginning of philosophy, at the beginning of Plato, of Descartes, and so on, of Kant, of Heidegger, too, or Deleuze, or me, all that is the same. At the very beginning of all that, we cannot say anything concerning being as such, because it's not a knowledge. So, when something is not a knowledge, you cannot continue by transmission. This point is in some sense difficult and obscure. If something is a knowledge, you have a teacher, a professor, who transmits the knowledge. And so you the knowledge itself don't really begin. The knowledge continues by successive transmission. So what is transmit? The transmission is always a transmission of a state of the knowledge, the contemporary state of the knowledge. Maybe you, for didactic reasons, you begin at a sort of beginning, but finally the transmission is the transmission of the knowledge as such. And so the beginning of a knowledge, in fact, is always in the form of repetition or continuation. There is continuity of knowledge, because the knowledge is cumulative. There is Greek mathematics, and after that you continue the knowledge. But why we can continue the knowledge? Because the knowledge has a precise object. And so you have a field, you have an objectivity, and in relationship to this objectivity, you have the successive progress of knowledge. So the ideology, the positivist ideology of the progress, the continuity, and so on, is absolutely in relationship to the definition of knowledge itself, the relationship to an object. So knowledge continues. History continues, physics continues, and so on. And you can speak of the progress of all that, and you can speak of the transmission of the contemporary state of problems and solutions in an objective field of knowledge. But if philosophy is not knowledge, philosophy probably cannot continue. Philosophy always begins. Philosophy always begins. And philosophy always begins and assume its past, naturally. May assume its past as a sort of successive beginnings. Plato begins, Aristotle begins, Descartes begins, and Kant and a philosophy is always a beginning of philosophy, with a past, but a past which is composed of beginnings. You know? And so the question of beginning is a very important question in philosophy. A philosophy begins, but how we can begin in philosophy? What is the beginning of philosophy? What is the beginning of Socrates, the beginning of Plato? If they don't continue something, if they don't say, okay, we know that, we know that, we know that, we know that, and we continue, we know something else. But it's not the case. You read the book of philosophy, they are not saying, I affirm, before me all philosophers have proofs, have knowledge of them, and I continue. No. All philosophers say, I begin. I begin. There is a big past, but I cannot continue all that. It's not absolutely different of the case of positive knowledge. There is no continuity properly. There is new interpretation of the past. So you can begin by a new interpretation of Plato, Aristotle, and so on. But your beginning is not Plato, Aristotle, and so on. Your beginning is the new interpretation. But what is this interpretation is new, because this interpretation begins something. But what is the beginning exactly? We know what is the beginning in the knowledge because we can know the objectivity of knowledge. But in philosophy, well, if philosophy is finally the creation of a new subjective desire and so on, what is the beginning? And how we can begin something of dialectical nature, something which is in relationship to negativity. You must begin by negativity. That is the only possible conclusion. Because we cannot begin by an object, by a positive object, if we are not in the field of knowledge. So, exactly as Socrates says, we must begin by nothing, in nothing. And naturally, you know that it's the example of practically all great philosophers. They begin by nothingness, in nothingness. The only thing that I know is that I know nothing. But I know nothing. After all, there is a positive affirmation in Socrates. I cannot know a thing, but I know nothing. But what is the sense of I know nothing? It's really obscure. I know nothing. Can you represent the signification of something like that? attempt to know nothing. Attempt to know nothing. So the beginning is not a knowledge. And when Socrates says, I know nothing, it's a joke, naturally. It's a verbal joke. The only thing that I know is that I know nothing. It's a joke. The verbal joke. The reality is that it's impossible to know nothing. The relationship to nothingness is not a knowledge, it's an experience, a subjective experience. And the form of this primitive experience is very fundamental in the differences of philosophy. For example, you know that the experience of nothingness in Descartes is the doubt, the absolute doubt. Absolute doubt. I know nothing, really. I know nothing. But I know nothing cannot be a knowledge. So it's a pure subjectivity, the doubt. It's an experience. It's very difficult to really doubt. Because it's not, it's not sexual. I am on my chair, I doubt too, I know nothing. No, it's a dramatic experience. It's a subjective experience which must be a real experience. Really, I must have the concrete experience of the total doubt. But it's a dramatic experience. It's something like a destruction of the world, a subjective destruction of the world. All is nonsense. I know nothing. I must go to this experience. It's not easy. It's not something like I write in a dissertation. I know nothing. If it is something like that, it's a joke, it's nothing at all. So the doubt, the Cartesian doubt, the doubt of the great rationalism of Descartes is existential in its nature, not rational at all, in fact. It's something which is the beginning, the dramatic beginning of the reconstruction of the possibility of knowledge. But at the point of the doubt, there is only the pure subjectivity in a negative experience, a completely negative experience. And the subject, the primitive philosophical subject, is negativity. The subjective dimension of philosophy is precisely the negative dimension. Something which is not reducible to an object, to a positive object. Something which is the subjective experience of power of negativity. I can be in the situation of total doubt, like an experience, personal experience. And in Kierkegaard or Heidegger, it is precisely said that that sort of experience is experience of anxiety, radical anxiety. Not at all a positive and clear movement of discovery of something. No, it's the power of negativity. And when we are really in the total doubt, you don't know if it is possible to go beyond. Maybe you stay in the doubt. Maybe you stay in anxiety. Maybe you stay in that sort of radical experience of negativity. And so the beginning of philosophy is something subjective, something existential, something like radical experience. And it is why, you know, the philosophy cannot continue at an individual level. Naturally, you can prepare something, you can read books, you must. You must read books, know some great philosophers and so on. But it's not the beginning, all that. Because all that is history, is finally something like a positive knowledge. So it's not the beginning of philosophy. Philosophy cannot begin in books. Cannot begin. So philosophy begins by an experience. And maybe many experiences, because the form of experience is different from an individual to another individual. The form of experience is not the same. But we know that that sort of experience is something which happens, not something we continue or which is decided, clearly decided by a rational decision. No, it's something which happens. Descartes itself, the doubt in Descartes itself, we can see that it is a sort of story, a subjective story. During a long time, there is no doubt in Descartes. Descartes continues the scholastic philosophy, but one day something happens, finally. And it is why there is something like a conversion, something like a subjective transformation at the beginning of philosophy. And this transformation is always in the form of the experience of negativity. It's not the experience of an object, it's not the experience of a situation, but across all that, it's the pure experience of negativity, the possibility of nothingness. You know, another form of the sentence of Socrates, the only thing that I know nothing, is the famous question of many philosophers, of Leibniz. Why there is something and not nothing? Why finally there is something? Why something exists? And why we are not in nothingness? Is there a reason for that? The question in technically is the question in Leibniz of the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is the principle which explains that if something exists, there is a reason to its existence. There is a reason which explains what this thing exists. But finally, the great question concerning the principle of sufficient reason is why is the reason of the existence of something? Why there is something and not nothing? Why we are not? This sort of question is also the subjective question of the possibility of nothingness. You understand that this question is a nonsense, is nothingness is purely nothingness. If nothingness is purely what does not exist, but it has the possibility of nothingness, the possibility of absolute nonsense of existence from the point of view of being. If you say existence is absurd, you say that from the point of view of being, inside the difference between to be and to exist. It's another form of what I name the negative beginning of philosophy. The negative beginning of philosophy. And it is why philosophy always begins. Because as a condition of philosophy, we have a form of experience of negativity. without that sort of moment where it's possible for us that there is a complete nonsense of existence, a complete nothingness of the signification, a complete nothingness of existence itself. Without this moment, philosophy cannot begin. So, philosophy can be defined comme a subjective victory against anxiety. If I name anxiety for the moment, that sort of experience, the experience of nothingness. But also the purely rational experience of the doubt in Descartes, but also the experience what Husserl names epoché. Epoché, it's a Greek word. What is the suspension, the interruption of any relationship to objectivity. I decide that objectivity is not here. I reduce all existence to my pure perception of existence, but without any objectivity in front of me. And that sort of experience is also naturally a purely negative experience, which is the same as Descartes in some sense. The experience of pure subjectivity. But the experience of pure subjectivity is always the experience of nothingness, because it's subjectivity without objectivity. So in the negation of all the field of objectivity. And we understand that by necessity the beginning of philosophy. If philosophy is not a knowledge, science, philosophy cannot be the development of the knowledge of objectivity. Because if knowledge continues, it's because there is a guarantee of objectivity. Without the guarantee of objectivity, there is no knowledge. There is pure subjectivity, but pure subjectivity is experience of something without objective existence. So, you understand that finally it's something like experience of pure being. Pure being apart of existence. And this is exactly the conclusion of Descartes. The victory of Descartes against the doubt is the affirmation that something really is the subjectivity itself. So the doubt itself. So when Descartes goes beyond the doubt by the affirmation that the existence of the subject who is in the doubt exists if the doubt exists. Descartes is saying that in the experience of negativity, something really is the experience itself. And so the existence of the experience of negativity is the victory against pure negativity. But it's the same thing that Socrates, logically. The only thing that I know is that I know nothing. Finally, you go from nothing to thing. And it's a fundamental gesture of philosophy. The possibility, at a moment of pure experience of negativity, to go from nothingness to the existence effective of thing. Or if you want, to go to being to existence, from being to existence. From pure being of something which does not exist to something which exists. To the duped, to the existence of the subject of the duped. And so on. There is many forms of all that. because there is also many beginnings, many individuals finally, many philosophers. Those are many forms of it. But there is an abstract form which is really the movement by which something can transit from nothingness to the affirmation of existence, from pure being to existence, or from experience, dramatic existence of nothingness to the clear affirmation of the existence, the certainty of the existence of something. And that is the first victory, if you want, of philosophy. If there is no victory, you are in a form of anti-philosophical philosophy, another form of anti-philosophical philosophy, which is nihilism. Nihilism. What is nihilism? Nihilism is that finally we cannot go beyond the experience of negativity. It's in Cartesian language, it's the doubt without God. Finally, the doubt without existence of supreme subjectivity. And you know, we know now two enemies of philosophy. Two different enemies, two contradictory enemies. The first enemy of philosophy is positivism, and all form of positivism. The only serious thing is knowledge. And finally, philosophy is a collection of jokes, of nonsense. You find something like that sometime in Wittgenstein himself. All propositions of metaphysics are nonsense. All that sort of experience, finally, is imaginary. Philosophy is a fantasy. Finally, philosophy is absolutely like myths, beautiful stories, and so on. But it's not serious. Not serious. It's the first enemy. The second enemy of philosophy is nihilism. Nihilism, which is finally more profound than skepticism. We shall discuss in a moment of the position of skepticism in all that. Nihilism is precisely the conviction that there is something which is not knowledge. It's the position that knowledge is not serious. So it's the complete reverse of the positivist situation. For the true nihilist, what is of importance is subjective experience, precisely. It is a point which is in common with philosophy. The critique of positivism, the possibility of nothingness, the fact that finally we must begin by a subjective experience, a radical subjective experience. That is the position which is in common between nihilism and philosophy. But what is nihilism? Nihilism is a conviction that the experience of negativity cannot be interrupted. We stay in the experience of negativity. We stay in anxiety. Anxiety is our destiny. And after that, we have no future, no knowledge. I must only exist. I must only exist in nothingness itself. So I must drink, enjoy the nothingness. And nihilism is a very strong position, but we understand clearly that the opposition of nihilism to philosophy and the opposition of positivism to philosophy are two contradictory positions. I think positivism is a position on the right of philosophy, and Nihilism is a position ultra-leftist. Radical position, ultra-leftist. We stay in the radical experience. We cannot go beyond that. So we cannot affirm anything. Only negativity. Only negativity. And philosophy, properly, is neither positivism nor nihilism. Philosophy tries to open a possibility of thinking not reducible to knowledge and positivism, but not reducible to the primitive experience of negativity, which is a necessity for philosophy itself. So the fundamental position of philosophy is that we have the possibility to go outside the experience of negativity, and to go to being, to existence. But nihilism say nothing exists properly. My being is to affirm the fundamental inexistence of everything. What exists is only existence itself, experience of existence. And so, the beginning of philosophy is nihilist in some sense. We have to go across nihilism. Without some experience of nihilism, I think there is no philosophy at all. We must know what is anxiety. We must know what is the experience of nothingness. We must open the possibility of nothingness. Because if we don't open the possibility of nothingness, there is pure objectivity and knowledge and nothing else. Not philosophy, in fact, not serious philosophy. Philosophy is serious because the experience of nothingness at the beginning. Without that sort of experience, philosophy finally is academic or reducible to a knowledge. But the philosophy is also the idea that we can go beyond nihilism. That is, to affirm that there exists truth, there exists something like truth, there exists positive affirmation of existence. Also, we can understand the distance between being and existence. For nihilism, there is no understanding of all that. There is only experience. The life, the living experience of nothingness is the last word of nihilism. For philosophy, it's not the last word. We must have that sort of experience, but we can go beyond. We can go beyond, and beyond we can find a real understanding of the distance, of the negative distance between to be and to exist. And finally, to have a thinking of negativity, and not only an experience. From experience to thinking, it's also the movement of philosophy. And positivism is thinking without experience of negativity, and nihilism is experience of negativity without thinking. It's the space for our determination, our vital determination. Finally, with or without university, in humanity, in the living humanity, there exist three positions. Everybody does a choice. There is a positivist position, to be and to exist in the world as it is, with knowledge, technology, interest, and so on. Be positive. Be positive. But be positive, I say, be positivist. The second position is nihilism. Experience of, radical experience of pure life as, in fact, in some sense, pure nothingness. To enjoy, and finally, the life under the power of the death. And the third position I name the philosophical one. And you know, philosophy is something very much more important than the pure philosophical discourse. The positive position is much more important than purely positivism. It's, in fact, the ordinary life, something like that, which is resignation, acceptation of the closure of knowledge, acceptation of something like the closure of the world. And the second position, which is an extremist in some sense, the second position is I refuse the world as it is. I stay in negativity, but I cannot go beyond. So it's pure refusal of the positive experience of the world as it is. So it's a radical critique of the world as it is in some sense, but there is no possibility of something else. There is no inside that sort of experience possibility of something else, so we stay in negativity. And philosophy, philosophical life is to assume the necessity of the nihilistic experience. To assume that we must go across the possibility of the world as it is purely and simply absurd and equivalent to nothingness. But we can go beyond this sort of experience. So we can go beyond the experience of pure negativity to positive affirmation outside positivism. And so the beginning of philosophy is negativity. But the great question of philosophy is affirmation. The beginning is a rupture with the positivist position. But the great question is the rupture with the nihilism. You know, it's the double fight of philosophy, the double fight of philosophy against the positivist resignation, but against too the nihilism as impossibility of affirmation. And in every philosophy you find this double fight. It's a manner to read philosophers. I propose you to read philosophers in the future like that. Where in that sort of philosophy, where is in reality the fight against positivism? And where is the fight against nihilism? And you can always find the singularity of a philosophy by the articulation between the two great fights. The importance of the critique of positivism is much more than the critique of nihilism, and so on and so on. There's many possibilities. It's a system of philosophy. We can read that like a symphony, a musical symphony. In a musical symphony, there is two things. There is the rupture with the silence and the return to the silence. It's always two sides. Music all forms of music are a double fight, a fight of the organization of the music itself, the structure of the music itself, against the silence, which is the beginning. You begin always music by the silence. It's impossible to begin music by another manner. But it's also always the preparation of the return to the silence. And the question of music is largely the question of beginning and of the end, the movement from the beginning to the end, which is also the movement from silence to silence. And so we can find in music a double fight too. The fight against the pure idea of the silence of the world, if you want, the nothingness of all noise. And on the other side, we have also the organisation affirmative on another form of silence. A silence which is inside music itself and which is at the end, at the rational end of music itself. And you know, this is why it's so difficult to finish in music. It's true for every form of music. There is music which continues indefinitely. There are music which brutal end. We have music which a long preparation to the end, like in Beethoven, for example, the end, finally the true end at the end, and so on. But also in jazz, for example, the question of the structure of the end is precisely the norm of the history of jazz. At the beginning, there is something really very coded in New Orleans style, for example, Armstrong and so on. You have a definition of the theme, variation, and the end. But when we are in Coltrane, the end becomes absolutely erratic. There is no end at all. And why all that? It's exactly like in philosophy. It's because there is a double fight in music. And so different form of organize the double fight. There is it's a fight against silence at the beginning and the fight against silence at the end. It's not at all the same thing. The contradictory fight. So my proposition is for you is to read philosophy in the manner that you hear music, and to have the sensibility not only of the rational and conceptual organization of a philosophy, very important naturally, but something which is like the tonality of a philosophy. It's tonality which is always its tonality in relationship to the tonality of nihilism, and its tonality in relationship to positivism. I mean, you know, it's absolutely clear. You perfectly know that you find immediately the relationship to nihilism in the theory of anxiety in Kierkegaard, or in the theory of eternal return in Nietzsche. So there are philosophy in which the tonality of nihilism is immediately present. And there are philosophy in which the tonality of positivism is clearly present too. Positive knowledge and so on, you find that from Aristotle to Searle clearly. So the true reading of a philosopher is to find the place of the tonality which is not the evident tonality. To find where is the nihilism of Descartes. Nihilism of Kierkegaard is not difficult. Where is the positivism of Kierkegaard? Difficult. And the understanding of a great philosopher is always the understanding of the two tonalities. And there is always a tonality which is more important than the other. You know that there is, in history of philosophy, philosophers like Hume or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Heidegger, the tonality, the nihilist tonality is absolutely present. You can find that without difficulty. And so the reading is to find the other tonality. And you have another comment, Aristotle, Descartes, or Spinoza. Naturally, the rational and positivist tonality is present. But to find the nihilist moment is the true reading. And so, really, it's important to read philosophers in a dialectical manner. That is, in finding contradictory tonalities in the development of a philosophy. And why then? Why? Because there is a double fight. Philosophy is against positivism and against nihilism. And against positivism, it is with nihilism, but against nihilism, it is, in some sense, with positivism. So there is mathematics and so on in philosophy itself. But the movement, the fundamental movement, is the movement to go beyond nihilism. Because the beginning is always in nihilism itself. The beginning is always some experience of negativity. You take, for example, the case of Kant, which is really rational critique of all pretensions of metaphysics and so on, which is the beginning of the modern critique, really, which is the beginning of the hand of classical metaphysics, Kant. But Kant, the beginning of Kant is absolutely negative. All what we affirm concerning God, nature, all that is imaginary, is false. We cannot know the real being. The first fundamental affirmation of Kant. So the first experience of Kant is not at all a clear and rational experience. The first experience is of negative nature. Our dream to know really the distance between to be and to exist, our dream to be really that sort of thing, is absolutely impossible. And so the beginning of Kant is also a dramatic experience of theoretical anxiety. If I cannot know being as such, what is my knowledge? After that, Kant reconstruct the possibility of a sort of knowledge, which is a part, affirmative part of this construction, the positivist part, finally, of Kant. But the beginning itself is purely of negative nature. And so, we stop here for the moment. We can say that philosophy can be defined by a primitive movement, which is a movement from the pure negativity to a first affirmation. The first affirmation just after the nihilist temptation. Just after the nihilist temptation, the possibility of a first affirmation. Like, for example, for Descartes, the affirmation of the real existence of the subject itself. And after that, Descartes reconstructs all the world, all the positivity. And so, we the most simple representation of philosophy is something like that. Very simple. It's a scheme of philosophy. All the problem is what is experience of nothingness and negativity, and it's the true beginning. And one is the emblem of the first affirmation. The first affirmation. And we can also, in ontological projection, say that the movement of philosophy is from the antecedent, the void, to the infinite, the first infinite. We stop here.